The first update is on Bolivia. The right-wing coup government that's in Bolivia has set the election for May 3rd. They've set their own electoral commission, which of course is ruling against the other side. A lot of members of movement towards socialism, which is the party of Evo Morales, have registered to be candidates, but they've already disqualified 57 of the people who have signed up. And it's usually, think about it as voter suppression, because what they do is you didn't have one little piece of paper, and so you can't go back and get it. So, and Evo Morales is running for the Senate. I don't know if he's been disqualified yet. I'm sure they will disqualify him. So anyway, there's just a lot of violence against members of movement towards socialism. And in Cuba, for those of you who watched the State of the Union, I didn't, but Trump basically mentioned Cuba in the State of the Union and his disdain for Cuba and for the government of Cuba. And he seems to be increasing his efforts against Cuba. And some of the things are they've tightened the embargo even more. And in the process, Venezuela is providing oil to Cuba to help them because they don't even have basic oil. There have been also decreases in the number of airplanes allowed to go to Cuba. And the interesting thing about this is that it affects Cuban Americans more than it affects, kind of tourists. And so the base in Florida is really weird at this point because the right-wing hardliners have increased their power with Trump and with Rubio and his other pals, and at the same time, Cuban Americans are really upset about the fact that they can't go visit their family, and they've decreased the amount that they could give remissions to their family members. So it's like kind of a stranglehold on Cuba.
Hi, my name is Sarah Martin, and I've got some updates on Venezuela and then one on El Salvador. And the first one is really good news. How many of you know about the Embassy Protectors? They were a group that, I'll just quickly explain. They were, after Venezuela was kicked out of Washington, a group of activists took over at the invitation of the Venezuelan government, occupied to keep it clean and going, and they also had workshops and all kind of things. For 3 or 4 weeks they were harassed by the opposition outside and ultimately dragged out by I suppose it was the Washington police, and charged. And they've been on trial, and their judge wouldn't allow, and sort of like the trials here around Honeywell, the judge was not letting let them talk at all about why they were there or about the situation in Venezuela. It was just a straight up, little more than trespass, because they were facing a year in prison and $10,000 yesterday. So it was really, it looked like, it was going to come to a very bad end. But yesterday it was a mistrial. The jurors couldn't agree, so and that's a real victory. Although it's not over, they have a pretrial hearing again on the 28th, and the government has to decide whether they'll retry them. But our victories are few and far between. So toast to the Venezuelan. Lift your cups to the Venezuela protectors. And then, okay, so now, business as usual. Yes, I'm sure you saw it on the news, even if you didn't watch the State of the Union. Who could bear to do that? Who did do it?
I did. A little bit.
All right. Anyway, somebody's got to see what the enemy's saying, so thank you very much. But Guaido was there. People have noticed that he was actually sitting on the steps and not in a chair. Whether that's true or not, I think it's a good story to pass around. So, but he was, of course, recognized by Trump, and it's the one time when Pelosi leaped to her feet for Guaido. It was disgusting. And this was after he's been on a kind of worldwide tour, pumping up support, which is actually flagging and going down considerably. And he went back to Venezuela and was met by a couple of supporters, which is, he has a few more than a couple, but even the opposition is divided on him now. But mostly opposition in the airport, or not opposition, people that oppose him in the airport, and so he did not have a grand entrance into Venezuela. And some of the workers were the workers at the airport who work for kind of, how do you say it, Conaviasa, which is the Venezuelan airline, and the U.S. has, or Trump has sanctioned that more. So, so they were there really pissed off, of course, about him. OPEC actually reported the highest output of oil in 6 months. And this is after years of it falling. And Ariaza, who was the foreign minister, just met with the International Criminal Court to have them pronounce the sanctions against Venezuela a war crime. And so there's a lot of action going on. The site I look at a lot is Orinoco Tribune and Venezuela Analysis, and they have really good up-to-dates on what's going on there, as well as the Gray Zone, which has reporters that really keep on top of stuff. In El Salvador, I'm sure you all heard this, that between, I think it was 1913, was it, and 2013 and 2019, those may not be the exact years, people who were deported, of those people, at least 138 were killed, and 70 were subjected to state torture and rape and all kind of things. So what people have been saying, you know, they have all along, is that they need to come here and seek asylum. It's very dangerous for people to go back to El Salvador. So with that, welcome to our coffee hour, and Kim.
Thank you, Sarah and Mercy, for those updates. Today we're here to hear Michael Livingston. He spent some time in Chile, and he was able to be in the middle of the uprising that was happening a few months ago. So to introduce him, here's some information about him. So Michael Livingston is professor of psychology at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, located near St. Cloud, Minnesota. He was also a longtime anti-war and anti-intervention activist. In 1980, he co-founded the Honduras Task Force, a group which opposed the U.S. militarization of Honduras during the Contra War against Nicaragua. In 1985, the Honduras Task Force merged with the Nicaragua Solidarity Committee, where he was active in opposing the U.S. war against Nicaragua as a part of that committee. Then in 1990, he joined the Persian Gulf Crisis Coalition, which posed the first U.S. war in the Persian Gulf. From 1992 to 2010, he shifted his political work to the workplace and was active in the American Association of University Professors. He served as president of the Minnesota State Conference. He was a member of the State Executive Committee and a member of the National American Association of University Professors. He served on both governmental relations and graduate student rights. During this period, he also chaired the university's faculty assembly and was a regent at the university. As a part of his job, Michael has directed 5 semester-long study abroad programs, 2 in Spain and 3 in Chile. As part of his responsibilities, he taught courses on the Spanish Civil War, the Franco dictatorship, the transition to democracy in Spain, and the popular unity government of Salvador Allende, the 1973 coup in Chile, the Pinochet dictatorship, and a transition to democracy in 1989 to 1990 in Chile. In addition to his work experiences, he also was a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras from 1976 to 1978. Since 2010, he's been active in the Iraq Peace Action Coalition, which is now renamed the Minnesota Peace Action Coalition. Recently, and this is why we're here, Michael's living and working in Vina del Mar, Valparaiso, thank you, which is actually right under number 2 on the map. So he's right in the middle of it. And this is the 2nd largest urban area in Chile. And he was there during the social explosion, and this is what it was called in Chile, which started in this past October 18th, 2019. So this talk will be an eyewitness account of what happened and the analysis of why it happened, and what it means for the rest of Latin America and the US. It will be based on his own experience, the reports in the Chilean media, and historical scholarship. The social explosion was a mass, mostly non-violent uprising against the neoliberal model of capitalism that is widespread in Latin America. And from those lessons, the countries that who have not adopted this model Bolivia until the recent soft coup against Evo Morales, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, they're going to be subject to a fierce pressure from the US to overthrow their governments. So let me welcome, and everyone welcome, please, Michael Livingston.
Sorry, if anybody's using the Wi-Fi, could you please turn your phones or your connections off, because we're having trouble with getting the video to work, so. Anybody who's got their phone on.
Should I I can put another hotspot out that people
Yeah,
could
you
use.
can.
I'll put a sign up with the
Okay.
information.
Sorry.
On the afternoon of Friday, October 18th, I was at a wine tasting in Vina del Mar. Chile has great wines, they have lots of wine tasting, and you started hearing this sound from the apartment buildings and the stores and the shops all around town. And this particular beat is something that comes from the dictatorship. From 1973 to 1989, the Chileans would protest the dictatorship by banging on pots and pans. And immediately in the evening, you started hearing this all over the city of Valparaiso and Vina del Mar. And so we knew something really, really big was happening. And that really big thing became known as a social explosion that mobilized millions and millions of Chileans into the streets against their government and against the economic model of neoliberalism which their government represents. So, I have some really cool photos and videos. We may not get the video connection. We'll see. No internet. That's okay. I have lots of photos too that'll come up. One of the interesting things is that Chile had an anti-war movement in the late 1960s. 1967, 68, and 69, there was a massive anti-war movement in Chile against the US war in Vietnam. And this was common of a number of Latin American countries. They had anti-war movements against US imperialism in Vietnam. And one of the leading artists, songwriters of the time, Victor Jara, wrote a song, El Derecho de Vivir en Paz, the right to live in peace. It is a beautiful song, and I have both the original and a new version of it, which became the anthem of this current protest. Now, Victor Jara was arrested. He was kidnapped after September 13th, September 11th, and he was tortured and killed in Santiago. And all of his songs were banned in Chile, but they were passed around later on cassettes and sheet music. And so people would sing these songs, and the right to live in peace, along with some of his other songs, became a kind of national anthem for Chile. And as soon as the protests broke out, people started singing this song in the original version, and a few days later the leading musicians in Chile recorded a revised version that represents the demands of the current protests. Later on, if we can get an internet connection, I'll play you the song, because it's very compelling and beautiful. So, Friday the 18th, protests against fare hikes in Santiago turned violent. The protest started Monday, the 14th, with high school students jumping over the turnstiles in the Santiago metro system. Santiago has the largest metro system in Latin America. It has over 130 stations. It serves hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people daily, mostly working class people. The rate fare, which was determined by a technical board made up of advisors to the company that actually runs the system, was 4 cents, 4 US cents. And the students were protesting because 4 cents is a lot of money, especially to their parents, in a country where the average person earns about $550 per month. So, the protests grew and the police tried to repress the protests, so the students escalated, and on Friday the 18th, they were joined by their parents and grandparents, and they sat down along the edges of the train platforms in the stations. So there are these very beautiful, compelling photos of the students and their parents and their grandparents with their legs dangling over the platforms in the subway stations. And the train drivers and their union refused to enter the stations or move the trains. They said, in a quote, "We refuse to kill our children and harm our passengers."
Wow.
So, the entire system collapses, and President Sebastián Piñera, who is a multi-billionaire, calls out the military and the police to clear the protesters from the stations. The police and military used a lot of violence, and this provoked confrontations between the protesters and the police. I want to emphasize that most of the violence was on the part of the police. So, this is on Friday, and the system collapses. There are lots of spontaneous protests in the evening. This is when the pots and pans started being banged all over Santiago, but also all over Chile. Because people learned about what was happening and they started protesting, so they started banging their pots and pans. People came out on their balconies, on their apartment buildings, or on their front steps, and they would just bang these pots. And the sound would start with just a couple, and then it would just ripple through cities of, like Santiago has 7 million people. The sound would just ripple through. the police tried to very violently repress the protests, and Piñera declared a state of emergency, which instituted martial law, a curfew, and turned over effective control of a lot of the government to the military. And on Friday, he declared martial law, Friday the 18th in Santiago, and as the protests spread, the next day he declared martial law, a state of emergency in the entire country, every single region. The curfew meant that the military had the right to arrest you. If you were a foreigner, they could immediately deport you, and also they could use tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets against you. Many people defied the curfews and protested anyway, but there were also large protests that took place during the day. The largest culminated on Friday, a week after the start of the toque de queda, the state of emergency, in Santiago. This is one of the photos. The news reported 1.2 million people out of a city of almost 7 million people. Later, they upped the official estimate to 1.5 million. All of the news media reports said the government always cuts the demonstration numbers in half. And the government has a long history of chopping every single protest number in half. And the independent media, the capitalist media said there is between 2 and 3 million people in the streets in Santiago, in a city of 7 million people. Now, this is one of the views. This is Plaza Italia, which is where a lot of the center of the protest took place. It's now been renamed by the Chileans as the Plaza de Dignidad, Plaza Dignity Plaza. This is one of them. One of the photos. Here is another view looking at a different way. This is the river. Here it's mostly dried up. They're facing what's called a mega drought. Very, very serious. And you see people going off in that direction. And then if the camera was turned looking this way, you would see even more people. And all of the streets, all of the major thoroughfares for several miles outside of this were filled with people marching towards Plaza Italia. But because it was all full, they would stop, and then they would have impromptu rallies and protests kind of where they would stop. And so the whole center of the city was just filled with this giant web of protesters. Here's another view. This is looking over from Bella Vista, if any of you are familiar with Santiago. The green trees there represent, it's just the tip of Parque Forestal, which is a very, very large park with lots of trees in it. Parque Forestal, which is a very large park, was completely filled with protesters all the way down to the market area. Can't get this. Okay, I'm going to back up real quick, and I was told I only get to speak for 30 minutes, so I'll keep to 30 minutes. Chile is a very long and narrow country. The length of Chile, if you went from New York to San Francisco, that's the length of Chile. It's very narrow. This is the gross domestic product of the GDP of the 3 biggest economies in the world. This is the per capita GDP of the countries in Latin America. Chile is the richest per capita country in Latin America. It is technically considered a developed country. Its average standard of living is very comparable to Portugal or Spain. Now, I want to say average because the average lies. Okay, you have an average per capita that is very, very high, but that doesn't reflect the reality for the majority of Chileans. In terms of just overall size of Latin American economies, Chile is 6 and climbing. Venezuela is 7 and falling because of the economic embargoes and the US sanctions against the country. And here's perhaps the most important economic data. These are the 10 most unequal countries in the world.
Could you just read those out for me, please? Because
Yes.
I can't see it.
So this is the Gini coefficient. It's a mathematical measure used by economists for income inequality. The higher the it goes from 0 to 1. The higher the number, the greater the income inequality. Any number above 0.48, 0.47 is considered extremely unequal. And of the 10 most unequal countries in the world, 8 of them are in Latin America. They are, from top to bottom, South Africa, Haiti, Honduras, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, Chile, Rwanda, Costa Rica, and Mexico. Now, I want to have you just think about some of the previous data. Chile is the most unequal developed country in the world. So you have very high standards of living on average, supposedly according to the statistics, but you also have the highest level of inequality of any of the developed countries in the world. And there are about 60 of them that are considered developed countries. Okay, so here's the timeline again that I mentioned before. The protest started on October 14th. On Thursday, October 17th, the police move in on orders by the government. They start beating the high school students. The next day, the students and their parents retaliate with the sit-ins on the edge. All of these protests, by the way, were nonviolent. The Chileans have a very long history of nonviolent struggle, and they've developed a number of very innovative tactics. And so they know how to organize a demonstration and a sit-in, and they know how to occupy buildings, and they know how to carry out campaigns and neighborhood campaigns. They are also very, very creative, and I'll show you some of that creativity in a moment. Okay, on the evening of the 18th, when I was in the wine tasting and I started hearing the pots and pans bang, that's when all hell broke loose. And the police were extremely violent with the protesters. They used water cannons, they used tear gas, they used billy clubs, and they also used rubber bullets that are kind of like buckshot. The guns that they use are a kind of assault shotgun, and the rubber bullets are very hard, they're very gummy, and they fired these indiscriminately into the peaceful protesters. So, we'll talk about the casualties and the consequences later. The violence is very interesting because it appears that there were kind of 3 different sources of the violence. Part of the violence was actually carried out by looters and criminals. And so when all the police rushed to the subway stations to try to beat up the high school students, all the criminals rushed to the grocery stores and the banks, and they started looting them. And of the 30 people that died, about half of those were actually looters who electrocuted themselves accidentally when they were breaking into a building, or they suffocated themselves when they set a building on fire, or they were store owners or employees who were killed by the looters, or looters who were killed by employees or store owners. Okay. So the first thing that happens is there's this massive spasm of looting and crime. much of it captured on videotape because Santiago is a heavily, it has heavy videotape surveillance all over the place. So a lot of it was captured on videotape. The second source of violence, the main source of violence was the police. But a second source of violence came from small anarchist groups, far less than 1% of the protesters, who systematically targeted symbolic institutions and attacked them with firebombs. And the third group appears to have been agent provocateurs. The metro stations on late Friday and early Saturday were bombed almost simultaneously. And the bombing took place with fairly high-level explosives, plastic explosives. And they were able to elude the videotape surveillance. The right wing immediately claimed that the bombings and the violence were carried out by agents of Cuba and Venezuela. And this was their narrative, that all the violence and all the protests were a result of outside agitators. There is zero evidence of that. Now, I want to back up to the 1973 coup. In the run-up to the coup, the right wing engaged in a lot of violent activities. And they had paramilitary violent groups that fomented chaos, bombed buildings, assassinated people such as Allende's military attaché, and they used it to provoke and justify a military coup. Most of the informed political observers in Chile think that the provocateurs were government agents. There's a current film by a very, very well-respected Chilean filmmaker with the last name of Wood. It's called Araña. It just premiered a few months before this happened. It premiered in August, about the fascist group in Chile that engaged in all of these things. The bombings, the arson, the assassin, the assaults, in order to provoke the coup. And this fascist group, this terrorist group, was funded by the CIA. So,
Surprise, surprise.
and so the most likely explanation for the very, very small number of real terrorist acts is that they were most likely carried out by provocateurs. Okay. The protests quickly shifted to mass nonviolent protests. And so these protests took place in every single major city in Chile. Every single major city in Chile. And the largest was on Friday, the 18th, where I showed you the photos. The next day, the Saturday, excuse me, the 25th. On the 26th, in the morning, there was a protest of about 200,000 people in Vina del Mar in Valparaiso. It was a massive protest. It had feeder marches that came from both cities that converged along the coast and then marched to the Congress. The Chilean Congress is not located in the capital in Santiago. The Chilean Congress is located in Valparaiso. And so they marched on the Congress, and they were met with a string of soldiers protecting the Congress. But that protest had people of all ages. It had lots of children in it, lots of elderly people. And one of the characteristics of the Chilean protests is that they're often very festive. So a lot of the protests that went by my window started out with motorcycles. So there would be a group of 100 to 150 motorcyclists on Harleys and other big bikes rumbling by really slow. And then they would be followed by usually 500 to 1,000 bicyclists. And then the bicyclists would go by. And then you would have the people walking with strollers, and walking hand in hand, playing musical instruments, chanting, and holding handmade signs. And these protests continued, although they started to decline after the 26th because Piñera and the government essentially made a number of concessions. Now, I want to jump ahead here. The protests have not stopped. On Valentine's Day, which was yesterday, there was a massive protest of around 50,000 people in Santiago calling for the resignation of the national police chief. There are protests every single week that are between 10,000 to 100,000 people. So the protests have not abated. Okay, what did Piñera do? I think I have 5 more. He reshuffled his cabinet, a typical tactic for bourgeois politicians. He fired the 8 of them that were the most unpopular, and he brought in some younger people, some more diverse people. He called for a reform package, and he did carry out a small number of reforms. It took them a week to reverse the 4-cent fare hike. And they also added some more money to the basic pension fund, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And they promised a new constitution. The new constitution has kind of 3 phases. The first phase already took place. There was a national referendum on whether they should have a new constitution. That passed with about 80% of the vote. The next vote is in April, where they're going to vote on the form of the Constitutional Convention, and there are essentially 2 forms. One is an elected Constitutional Convention elected by universal suffrage. The other is a big chunk of the people are going to be the currently sitting Congress, the senators and representatives, who are a big part of the problem, as automatic delegates. So people are already arguing about which form. All the right-wing parties want their members to be automatic delegates. All the left-wing parties want a voted or an elected constituent assembly. And then they're talking about the different provisions, possible provisions of the Constitution. Just as an aside, my wife is an attorney. This weekend, the weekend of the 19th and 20th, because a lot of the protesters were spontaneously demanding a new constitution, we ran out and looked at all the bookstores in the city. Every single copy of the Constitution had been sold out the day before. The Chileans were buying their Constitution and studying it. Okay, so that's kind of where we are now. Let's see if I can get one of the images. It won't display the images. Okay. I have 2 images that I got during the protest. One was from my favorite political cartoonist. It showed the speaker in Congress gaveling for order, and in English, the translation is, "It's time to end these beautiful speeches and move on to action. It's time to go to lunch." And this political cartoon nicely summarizes the political system in Chile. In some ways, it resembles our own. They don't do a lot, and usually what they do doesn't benefit most of the people. The other photo that I took was of a sign that was hand-painted and on a piece of brown paper and taped to one of the poles at the bus stop. And the Chileans did a lot of really brilliant signs, and they put up graffiti and signs on all the walls. They would just go home and with paints and crayons and stuff, they would write stuff up and they would put it on the board. And this one said, it's not the rate hike, it's the Constitution, the education system, the pension system, the corruption, the cost of healthcare, and then it ended with the slogan, organize, and then what became the rallying cry, or the description of the protest, Chile awoke. Chile despertó. And so, and you've heard this expression, Chile despertó, everywhere. And they're not going to go back. They're not going to accept the essential neoliberal model that they've been living under. Okay, now some background. The current constitution was written by the former dictator. And when the transition to democracy occurred in 89 and 90, the democratic politicians essentially realized that they couldn't antagonize the former dictator and the military and the ruling class. And so they had an expression that they were going to govern with the enemy. And so they made a lot of compromises. And one of the compromises was they accepted an undemocratic constitution that also incorporated the neoliberal model. Now, the neoliberal model came into vogue in policy discourse in the United States in 1980. It came in vogue under the Reagan administration, and it was imposed by the World Bank and the IMF, and also the EU, and a number of countries around the world. But it didn't originate in 1980. It originated in the very early 70s. And the first country to have the neoliberal model imposed on them was Chile. When the coup took place in 73, the CIA had prepared a giant document of economic changes. It was called El Ladrillo, the brick, because it was about this thick. And they handed it to the Chilean government and said, these are the changes that we want to see instituted. And it was the complete privatization of their economy. And it was the neoliberal model. They stripped away government ownership, they stripped away government regulation, they made it possible for the wealthy to become super wealthy, and they destroyed the Social Security safety net that had been in place and had been built over a long period of time, but was especially prominent during the Allende administration. They destroyed all of that, they privatized the economy. Chile became the model and the showcase for neoliberalism. And it is an economic model which has since been imposed on virtually all of Latin America. And any country that dares defy that model, be it Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, or Bolivia, gets ultimately undermined and attacked by the United States. There is a very consistent pattern here. Either you have a government of the super rich, for the super rich, and by the super rich, or you don't have anything. So, what were the main issues? Well, one was the Constitution. The second is that under Pinochet, the pension system had been privatized. These are called AFPs. They're different funds that you have to invest in. It's by law, but the funds are privately owned. Half of the AFPs are actually American corporations or American banks. They charge really high rates of service fees, and they have much lower rates of return than they promised. So middle-class Chileans can pay their entire life into the pension fund, and then when they retire, they'll have barely anything. They'll have 1/3 of the minimum wage. Okay. So many of the high school students, many of the protesters at the metro stations said, we are doing this for our grandparents. They were very clear. We are doing this for our grandparents. Okay. Under Pinochet, by the way, George Bush Jr., before he got sidetracked by Afghanistan and Iraq, was trying to revise our social security system and model it after the Chilean system. And this is still part of the Republican Party platform.
Didn't Pinochet give us a sort of American Social Security system to the military, then everything else was privatized?
Yeah, the military has a great social security system.
Yeah.
They have a great pension system. They also have a great hospital system, by the way. Whereas most Chileans have to pay a fortune for hospital care, the military has a great hospital care. And just this year they revised the Constitution before all this broke out, because the military budget is in part secret. Part of the military budget is secret and comes from a percentage of the copper export revenues. And so the mining industry was connected to the military, and the military got a cut of that outside of the normal budget. That was just changed this year. It was considered a big advance, it was, but considering how massive the problems were, it's a small reform. The education system was privatized. They created a 3-tier system. The top tier are elite private schools that cost around $10,000 to $20,000 US a year or more. Then there is a second tier that are essentially charter schools. The parents and students have to pay, but the government also gives a subsidy for students. Many of these are for profit. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are corrupt. And then there's a public education system that is absolutely horrible, because it has been systematically defunded since 1973. And they want a high quality education system for everybody that's public. There are very low wages and very high income inequality. One of the debates that was taking place in Congress before the social explosion was to reduce the work week to 40 hours. It was 45 hours. Gas, electricity, water, and a bunch of other things, it's all been privatized. And over the last 3 or 4 years, there have been massive scandals in Chile by water companies that have been selling tainted water, contaminated water, and because there's no controls on them, the more they can sell, the better. The other thing is the rate structure of the water supply. As a consequence of the drought, rich people can water their lawns. Poor farmers essentially have all of their cattle and sheep, all of their livestock die of dehydration. And there has been in the last 12 months a rash of farmer suicides associated with farms going under because they can't, because of the climate change, they can't afford to buy the water to produce grass and foliage for their livestock. They have very high costs of healthcare and very high costs of drugs. Some of the drugs cost as much as they do in the United States. They have widespread corruption in business and politics. My favorite example of this is something I discovered when I was in the Atacama Desert. This last time, the Atacama Desert is in the far north, near the border of Peru and Bolivia. It is a main copper mining area, but it's also one of the top 3 lithium producing areas in the world. And the lithium mining companies drill very deep holes into the ground, and then they suck up the groundwater, and they filter the groundwater for lithium. And then they put the water into pools outside in the desert, and all the water evaporates. Now, the consequence of this is that the groundwater is disappearing. So the desert is essentially being mined of water for the production of lithium. Now, there's an easy fix to this. You simply recycle the water and pump it into the ground.
It's not toxic after they use it like that?
No, it's not toxic. You take out the lithium and you pump the water back into the ground. Now, the law governing the lithium companies mining, though, was written by the lithium companies. And there are several cases of bribery where prominent politicians were bribed by the lithium companies to get this law passed that has no environmental safeguards and is essentially destroying the water, the aquifers under the Atacama Desert. So there's lots and lots of corruption in business and politics. Finally, there is massive repression of the native people, the Mapuche. Unfortunately, we'll see in the end if I can get the videos up. Many of the Chileans carried the Chilean flag, and they often wrote stuff on it. Or they carried the Mapuche flag. The Mapuche are the indigenous people of Chile who have been systematically discriminated against and repressed for hundreds of years. So the protesters were carrying the Mapuche flag and the Chilean flag in the protests. And finally, their system, in some ways, like our system, is a highly regressive tax system. The poor and middle class pay for the tax cuts for the rich. The rich don't pay very much in taxes. And so these are the basic elements. These are the basic elements of the neoliberal model. And that is what the Chilean people are protesting against. I want to wrap up. I'm a little over my allotted time, but I want to wrap up by saying that this scenario, this anti-capitalist protest, anti-neoliberal protest, can easily happen in any of the Latin American countries. They all suffer from, no case is identical in Latin America, but they all suffer from the same set of problems associated with this economic model. And so I think Latin America could easily explode as Chile exploded. Thank you very much. Okay. Now I'm supposed to have questions, and I'll also try to get Tim, you want to MC the questions? Yes, you can MC the questions.
Well, let's give another round of applause to Michael. Very interesting. First, before we take questions, we'll ask for donations. Go ahead.
Well, one of my questions is, when you say the provocateurs are causing a lot of the tribulation, are they Chilean people? Or what constitutes the provocateurs? Are they from USA or are they local people? Who are they?
They don't know. They don't know. So
Kind of like spies.
it's interesting that in a country that has so many video cameras, they can't find the provocateurs. Now they wore masks. So they don't know.
Are there any other questions? Great. And if you want to speak loud enough, or should we have people come up?
I don't want to come up.
Okay.
I'll speak loud. There's, in Bolivia and in southern Brazil and parts of Argentina, there have been these old Nazis from Germany, Italy, and France. Klaus Barbie organized 600 of them for a coup in Bolivia in 1980. So they were really prevalent. Now they're, pretty old. They're alive. But that whole fascist death squad environment they have in that area. My question is, has it spread to Chile?
The best answer I can give you is it hasn't spread to Chile. It has always been in Chile. So Chile has a very large German immigrant population, and fascism was very well established there well before World War II. During the Pinochet dictatorship, there was a kind of Nazi enclave in the south called Colonia Dignidad. And there's a movie, I think, with Natalie Portman, I can't remember, based on La Colonia Dignidad. It was a fascist enclave, and the fascists, the German fascists had very strong links with the Chilean military. And the Chilean military was actually formed by the Prussians, the German Prussian army. And they've had these deep connections going back for 100 years.
Go ahead.
It sounds like the Chilean people are more politically aware than people in most places, like the US and so on. I'm wondering if that's because I bet every Chilean is aware of the overthrow of Allende and the connections with the CIA and all of that, and so it's a very upfront political education that they have that others haven't had. I'm wondering if you would agree with that and the implications.
You have to realize that there are a large number of people in Chile, especially wealthy people, that think that the general was a god. And they long for the days when the dictatorship will return. And so it's a deeply divided society, although the majority were very, very much against the dictatorship. And they do have a very, very high level of political education, both in terms of their understanding of their own history, the understanding of US imperialism, and their understanding of political tactics, how you mobilize, what you do. So the protests were described as being spontaneous because there was no large political party or large union that started them. They weren't spontaneous, they were organized by small groups of activists, communicating over the internet or over their cell phones. But because they had such a high level of political consciousness, tens of thousands of people started organizing immediately. Now, I want to give you a little story. My wife and I were walking down the street, looking at all the posters, and a mom was with her 5-year-old son, and they were walking along, and the son was saying, "What's this, Mommy?" And she was describing the protests, and then she said, "Well, why are they protesting? Why did they want a new constitution?" And she said, "Well, it all goes back to the 1973 coup and the dictatorship imposed by General Pinochet." And so the moms and the dads and the family conversations are highly political. And they talk about their history, and they talk about political tactics, and they talk about demands. And this latest outbreak comes after almost 2 decades of mass mobilization. There's been mobilization about women's rights, gay rights, environmental concerns, reform in the pension system, and reform in the education system, and reform in the healthcare system. And some of these protests were small, 10,000, some were big, like 200,000. But it comes after 20 years of protest, and so they have experience, they have knowledge, and they talk to each other. And I don't know about other Latin American countries, but compared to the United States, they are so far advanced politically compared to us.
Right. Go ahead in the back. We'll get to you, Kathleen.
Yeah, you mentioned that program that was given to the government of Chile after the coup, called the break. It was a neoliberal program to implement. But I would like you, maybe you know the history of course you know the history of the Chilean undergraduate from the Chicago University of Economics. And they, when they graduated, they returned to Chile, following that program, and then they implemented that kind of program in the universities of Chile. And later the whole program was trying to be implemented in the rest of the countries. In Latin America, you have example of those in different countries, like in Mexico, Salina de Gortari was one of them. He was Chicago Boys. I think the Honduras Callejas was in jail, still in jail. Maybe he's not fully Chicago Boy, but he received some training there. And then there is other example of other presidents in Latin America who were Chicago Boys, all corrupt guys. And maybe you can expand a little bit more. So
this is a very important point. The economic theories of neoliberalism were developed by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. And the brick was written essentially by his graduate students and him, being paid for by the CIA. A number of the key economic advisors in Chile to the military had been trained at the University of Chicago. And they were known as the Chicago Boys in English, and in Chile they were known as Los Chicago Boys. And this economic model was then imposed on the rest of Latin America. Okay, so this is the product of the Chicago boys. Now, so this is a very important point that Marcel is making. The other thing, though, that I want to say is that the ties between the elite in Latin America and the United States are very strong. And a lot of them are even more direct than the Chicago boys. Sebastián Piñera, who is a multi-billionaire, has a PhD in economics from Harvard. And a lot of their top politicians have PhDs, or at least undergraduate degrees, from American universities, and they have been trained by right-wing academics, right-wing scholars, and right-wing politicians. And they have very, very close ties with these politicians and with the ruling class in the United States. Okay? They have very, very close ties with the super rich in the United States. Okay.
One comment I'd like to make is that I wish we could get that kind of outpouring, like you said, 3 million people in Santiago. I wish we could get that here. But the thing is that we are not as well educated as they are, politically. But then when I wanted to ask another question about Valparaiso, they have very colorful houses, and I heard that they lost a lot of them in a fire that were set by maybe what you call agent provocateurs. Is that true?
Some of that, so Valparaiso is part of it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a deeply working class city. Just to give you some of the background, for many years before the coup, it was a stronghold of the Communist Party of Chile, and Salvador Allende was born and raised in Valparaiso. It's a beautiful city, it's a gritty city, it's a working class port city. It has a glowing, brilliant culture. A lot of colorful houses. Some of the houses were burned down, some of the buildings were burned down in the protests. Others were burned down by provocateurs. But there's even a more important thing here. I was there in the rainy season. I got there in July. And during the rainy season, it rains a lot. It didn't rain once from mid-July to mid-December. All the forest lands in the Central Valley are totally dried out. And what happened is that some people were going into the forests with lighter fluid, gasoline, and they were starting fires. One of the, late in November, my wife and I came out of a restaurant. This was after the coup ended. It was about November 18th. And I looked up to the hills that are to the east of Vina, and there was a big fire. And I said, gee, that looks about where my university is. And so I immediately texted my boss. He texted back, can't talk now. We're fighting a fire. We have to save the university. So these fires were deliberately set. And because the ground is so dry and the foliage is so dry, forest fires are a very, very serious problem. And so for the last week the last 2 weeks of November, the sky was essentially blackened by soot from the fires.
Sarah's next.
How big are the movements in Chile, or the peasants and the students and the women's movement? And then do most people find inspiration from Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua?
I don't think they find a lot of inspiration from Venezuela, Nicaragua, or Cuba, although they're very politically knowledgeable about those countries. In addition, there's an immigration crisis in Chile. And there are lots and lots of Venezuelans there. There are also lots and lots of Haitians. Those are the two largest immigration groups.
The movements?
So, the movements... So, don't quote me on this, Sarah. But they seem to draw inspiration from their own history and their own traditions of struggle. Now, I want to just back up here. these movements have had lots of success. I think it was 2004, divorce was finally legalized in Chile, which was a big, big deal, because they had to struggle against the right wing and against the Catholic Church. And then in, I think, 2016 or 2017, they legalized civil unions. So in a very short period of time, they went from legalizing divorce to legalizing gay marriage. Now, it turns out that in the civil unions, about 75% of them are heterosexual couples that don't want to get married, and 25% of them are homosexual couples. But there has been a dramatic change in terms of gay rights, women's rights, and so on, in a very, very short period of time because of these mass movements. Now, let me just make this a little bit more complicated. There's also a very strong wave of anti-women violence. And as women have made strides, such as with gay rights and with legalized divorce, the violence against women seems to have increased, and this is a major issue for the women's movement in Chile. I have a couple examples. Some of the police were targeted by the anarchists or by the agent provocateurs. In particular, 2 of the women police officers, because now Chileans have women in the army and women in the police, were attacked with Molotov cocktails. So you have these horrific photos of women in uniform on fire. And they didn't attack the men, they explicitly attacked the women. So you have...
Anarchists did this?
They don't know who did this.
Oh.
So now, in addition to that, during the police repression, during the military repression, women were often targeted. So there's a strong misogynist dynamic here in the repression and in the social explosion.
Mike?
Yeah, can you talk about the media in Chile? Who owns it, who controls it, and is there a healthy independent outlet there?
There's a very, very small independent media. The main newspaper is El Mercurio. They also own the main national newspaper. They're kind of like our New York Times, Wall Street Journal. They also have El Mercurio de Valparaiso, which was the first paper founded in Chile. And I believe they own another 14 papers. The El Mercurio is owned by the Edwards family. The current editor, who is an Edwards, used to work for the New York Times. He was brought back by his dad to take over the paper. They also own the Banco de Chile and Banco Edwards, 2 of the major banks. They are part of the billionaire ruling elite of Chile. And they also own some radio stations and some other things. And the media is highly corporate controlled. And this is one of the reasons why, if you would go to these protests, you would realize that, oh, they're massively nonviolent, and all the violence is coming from the police, but that's not what you saw on TV. That's not what you saw in the newspaper. Because they would always show somebody throwing a Molotov cocktail at a bank or something. The media is corporate controlled.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. Go ahead.
What is the role of the Catholic Church? I mean, they've traditionally been very right-wing, so I'm just wondering what their influence is now.
The history of the Catholic Church in Chile is very interesting because it essentially split during the dictatorship. So part of it sided with the dictator, especially the hierarchy, and another big part, especially the Bishop of Santiago, sided with the oppressed. And they investigated human rights and they provided shelter for activists and so on. And they were often victimized, killed by the military. So the church split, and after the transition to democracy, it maintained a lot of its popularity. So the first time I went there in 2014, my wife is Catholic, so she goes to Mass every day. Sometimes I would tag along just to get the pulse. And the churches were all full, which is very unlike some place like Spain, If you go into the church in Spain, there are 5 old ladies. In a church that seats 1,000 or 500 or something. Okay. You would go into the Chilean churches and they would be full. But there were problems at the time in 14 because there was evidence that the Catholic hierarchy had been hiding evidence of pedophilia and sexual abuse. Okay. So, flash forward 5 years from 14 to 19, and now those cases of pedophilia and sexual abuse have become public, and the church has refused to do anything about them, and now the churches are half empty. So there's a very dramatic shift in 5 years.
Is there still any more progressive liberal, influence?
Yes, there are some progressive liberal Catholic priests and nuns, and then there's also the
bishop.
conservative side as well.
Go ahead. You said the fires were deliberately set. I'm wondering, was it known who set them and why?
They don't know who set them and why.
I'm thinking here also of Australia, with fires going on, and there was some rumor that those might have been deliberately set, but...
They don't know, I'm sorry.
Huh.
I've heard that arson is a very small part of it. These are being set because of climate or global warming.
And I think it all depends
And they
on
won't
what's
acknowledge
going on.
it.
We just have a few more minutes. I'm going to call on Karen and then you. If you have a quick question?
It's pretty quick. I was wondering, you mentioned divorce and same-sex marriage, but one of the things that really tells you about women's control over their lives is reproductive rights laws. So what are those like?
I don't know what they're like, although I do know that birth control is widely available.
But abortion, that's usually the Catholic Church.
I don't know.
In Argentina, they're in a big fight.
I don't know if abortion is legal yet. Does anyone know if abortion is legal in Chile?
It's not.
No? Okay, it's not. So.
All right, go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about U.S. military presence in Chile? Do we have bases there? What's our presence and how interactive are they with?
So, as far as I know, there are no U.S. military bases in Chile at the time, but there are frequent naval visits. The U.S. Navy comes into Valparaiso, which is also where the Chilean Navy has its headquarters. So U.S. ships are coming in all the time for visits. The more interesting thing is that a big chunk of the Chilean officer corps has been trained in the United States by the United States. And that's at
arms sales.
I don't know about arms sales. They do have lots and lots of money to buy weapons, though. All that copper revenue. So they have a very large military that's well funded, that's trained by the United States.
All right. Is it a really good Whopper question?
Has there been evangelical growth like there has been in Brazil, in Chile?
Yes.
All right. We know where that's going to lead to. Thanks again, Michael, for speaking. Before we wrap it up, we'll make some announcements. And then if you're ever so kind, you could bring your dishes. There's a container on the back table. Not yet, because I'm going to do some announcements. But thanks again for coming. We really appreciate you all coming and listening and participating. So the next event, we'll go in chronological order, is February 29th. It's sponsored by WHAM End War Committee and Veterans for Peace, Chapter 27. Saturday, February 29th at 10 a.m. here. They're making connections to climate crisis and U.S. militarism. So that's a very hot topic and very important topic to come and listen and learn about. It's a pink flyer. It's on the table back there. And Sarah Martin, back in the corner, her and Brad Siegel from the Minnesota Immigrants Rights Action Committee, they went to Venezuela, when was it?
A couple weeks ago.
To participate in the Venezuela Anti-Imperialist Congress. So they got to meet all these fighters around the world. So we're doing a report back with those two at 2 p.m. March 1st, which is a Sunday, at Mayday Books. So it's a really important report back to go and listen to. Don't have flyers, but it's going to definitely be on all your mailing lists. March 8th, Sunday, is International Women's Day, and Freedom Road Socialist Organization is having a rally. It said here. Okay, because it's to be announced. So it's here, 4200 at 1 o'clock. Also, you'll see it on your mailing lists, emails. All right. And then the next day, Monday, March 9th, it's the it's Wham's second Monday movies, and they're presenting Official Secrets. So it's Monday, March 9th at 2 p.m. here. So this is a very popular place. It's 7 p.m., March 9th, here.
That was the report.
Okay, all right, so the report back of Venezuela, actually, it's at May Day. So just check all your emails and all your listservs, and there'll be a whole list. All right. And then the next coffee hour will be here on March 14th, Saturday, starting at 9:30. It'll be focusing on Haiti. So if you love coming to these coffee hours, we have once a month. So hope you'll come back.
And Michael's going to be at May Day on Thursday. 7 p.m. at May Day Books.
What date?
The 20th.
20th, Thursday.
Okay.
What topic?
I'm going to be talking about Chile, but I'm going to be talking about the political and tactical strategy of the protest movements.
So do you want to repeat the date and time and place?
It's at Thursday, May Day Book, 7 o'clock, the 20th.
Just this next 4 days.
So I'm assuming that all these events will be on all your listservs. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.